Building at Eastern Mennonite University's graduate program in conflict transformation. Our topic for this last hour is on what resorting of U.S. agency roles and resources is needed in Washington and on the ground to address fragile and failed states more efficiently. This morning we held a briefing on this exact topic on the Hill, and one of the senior professional staff responded, "This is our biggest headache." Because it's not only a matter of how do we reorganize government and figure out a government structure that's both organizationally competent, deals with the egos and the agencies and the interaction between them, but then how do you convince Congress to fund what is indeed rational and needed? So the challenge is monumental. Another staffer on the Hill said, what are we going to do in a place like Afghanistan where we can't make the commitment for more USAID funds in the coming year? And a member responded, it's going to take a year in Afghanistan. They're going to have to see that we can't do it without a bigger USAID role. And then we'll come back in a year and we'll finally get better resourcing and capacity and assignment of roles, et cetera. So this is a critical question, and we have three of the foremost scholars who are working on these questions and issues today. Ruben Brigady from the Sustainable Security Program at the Center for American Progress, Gordon Adams of American University and the Stimson Center, and Dane Smith from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And their bios, again, are in your handouts. I won't go over those. I'll invite Ruben to the stage.
Okay, thanks. Go from here. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you, and I send my gratitude to Michael Lund for inviting me here today. I note that we have been placed strategically at the last panel of a long day of panels on a Friday afternoon. So we're probably one of the last things stopping between you and happy hour. So I'll do my very best to be brief and entertaining and hopefully relatively informative all in the process. I'm a reasonably simple-minded person. So I will, when I was asked by Michael to think about this question, I do as I always do, and that is sort of go to first principles. And it strikes me that the very notion of thinking about new structures and resources for U.S. policy towards failed and fragile states suggests two things, which require some level of thought. The first is that there is indeed some particular special, unique strategy that is required for U.S. policy towards failed and fragile states, separate from what we do normally as a means of pursuing our interests. And the second is that assuming that such a strategy is required, that our current governmental organization and current legal architecture is insufficient to support that strategy. We have spent a great deal of time, or you have spent a great deal of time earlier today talking certainly about the former, and I think we can assume that there is something that is unique about failed and fragile states. I apologize for not being here for most of it, but I'll just sort of give you certainly what seems obvious to me. It isn't so much that that failed, fragile states have any particular greater urgency than, for example, the urgency of dealing with U.S. great power relations or the urgency of dealing with active hostilities and armed conflict. For me, obviously, the most perplexing problem of addressing failed and fragile states is that they require the reestablishment or strengthening of governance, which is by itself a multifaceted proposition across a wide variety of governmental functions, across a wide variety of actors, both within our government, with the host nation government, and with the broader international community. And that leads you to the fundamental problem of all governmental action, and that's a problem of coordination. If one could simply break down or simply assume that addressing a problem of failed states was the matter of simply applying kinetic force, or simply a matter of applying development resources, or simply a matter of deploying police forces, or any number of the series of individual actions that were required, that actually be a simpler proposition. The problem, of course, as we all know, is that it is that myriad series of challenges, how one sequences these things, which I take that Ambassador Dobbins addressed earlier today, how one prioritizes them, and how one makes each of those the combination of those functions be greater than the sum of its parts, and how one does all that according to a time frame that is acceptable both to the intervener, to the host nation, and the international community as a whole. That's a tough challenge. Made even more problematic if you don't have a governmental structure which can support that challenge. And one need only take a look at our series of ad hoc approaches to failed and fragile states over the last decade and a half, and look at our, at best, relatively meager record of success in places from Haiti to the Balkans to Afghanistan, Somalia, etc., to know that our governmental structures are problematic. Here's what's different now, in my view, compared to how we've addressed these problems from the governmental perspective of the last 10 years. One is that we have, in the last 3 to 4 years, recognized that the problem of failed and fragile states is indeed a problem of vital national interest of the government of the United States. It is not simply a backwater problem to be addressed by Canadians or whatever, right? Or whatever sort of the hope I've not offended. Well, I'm sure I have actually offended any Canadians in the room. Well, Lisa was, yeah, sorry. But however, sort of whatever the sort of main thinking was of the U.S. national security establishment in the mid-1990s, that indeed we actually as a government have a vital interest in addressing that. Because we have a vital national security interest in stabilizing and improving governance in failed and fragile states, that automatically has garnered the attention of the heavy hitters in our national security and foreign policy arena, principally the Pentagon and the armed services. I see some friends here in the room with whom I worked on the Marine Corps' Operation Joint Urban Warrior exercise about a month or so ago. For those of you who are not there, you'd be surprised. You would be interested to know that periodically, every year, the Marine Corps does an exercise on some pressing problem of strategic national importance. This year, the U.S. Marine Corps, our toughest warriors, America's 911 force, decided to focus their strategy on conflict resolution in a failed or fragile state. So the fact that even our Marines recognize that this is a vital problem of national security interest tells you how important it is to our warriors, and therefore how important it is to our national security posture overall. As a result of which, in my view, some of the most innovative thinking about how we structure our government to deal with failed and fragile states, frankly, has happened in the context of our military. And one can see that on a variety of both doctrinal and organizational standpoints. Whether doctrinally, we're talking about the advancement of DoD Directive 3000.05, which places stability operations as a core mission of the U.S. military alongside combat. Whether you're talking about the new guidance to our regional combatant commanders, the guidance for the deployment of the force, which requires our 4-star combatant commanders to think proactively about how one uses military assets to shape developments in their various areas of responsibility. And this is particularly true in places of low governance, where you're talking about aspects of the Philippines or talking about the Horn of Africa or elsewhere, Haiti in the Southcom AR, etc. It's also has to be noted that USAID, with their fragile state strategy that was put out about 3 or 4 years ago, has been doing some very important thinking along this line. And even the State Department is recognized. I didn't mean even the State Department. You kind of know what I mean. That the State Department has recognized that the nature of the sorts of assets that they need to deploy to the field are very, very different from what has been required by conventional diplomacy throughout the history of the department. And indeed, with the creation of the Civilian Response Corps, is doing something which, to my view, at least I'm not aware of, that virtually no other foreign ministry in the world has done. And that is how can we, as professional diplomats, deploy the broad range of civilian expertise to the field that is required, not only to help stabilize states, but also to partner with our military. So all of those things are useful developments. Here are, in my view, 3 major problems. The first is that none of them are happening with any great deal of coordination amongst each other. The military has been aggressively pleading for civilian partnerships to help them think through how to engage in stabilization operations in unstable states, to ask for a much more robust civilian partner that has people, that has resources and doctrine that can be applied when and where needed and the quantities needed. And they have been frustrated in finding a supportive enough partner in AID and state. Not partners that aren't willing. AID certainly is willing, as is state. But we have not had but because of, certainly in the case of AID, the way in which they've been dramatically downsized the last several years, it's made it the last sort of decade and a half, have made them not the sort of partner, robust partner as they would like to be or as the Defense Department would like to be. As a result, the Defense Department has not said, well, I guess we're not going to have a civilian partner. I guess we'll just sort of sit on our thumbs and just focus on, dropping bombs on people. They have recognized that the mission set will not disappear even if it takes a while for our civilians to develop the capacity that the military would like them to have. And that's why they've moved much more aggressively in this space, in the view of some in the civilian development community, in a way that has been problematic with regard to the militarization of foreign assistance or the militarization of our foreign policy generally. And yet that movement is, as I mentioned, in my view, has occurred not because of any sort of power grab per se, but because of a recognition of the mission set, the strategic importance of it, and the need to move in that space. That's the first problem. The second problem, related to the first problem, is that our executive branch at the highest levels has been relatively slow to develop a sort of chapeau, as it were, to effectively provide coordination amongst the various civilian agencies that are required in dealing with failed and fragile states or stabilization and reconstruction operations. The Bush administration, to their credit, tried with the creation of SCRS. In my view, the creation of SCRS in and of itself is representative of a failure to do that coordination at the National Security Council, which is where it ought to belong. And we have, frankly, this administration is too new yet to have developed a robust National Security Council mechanism to do that. We obviously know that General Jones has recently put out a reform structure for the NSC, but it's going to take a while to actually see how that plays out. We know that SCRS has developed the Interagency Management System, which is a relatively sophisticated tool to manage responses to crises and stabilization reconstruction operations. The problem is it has never been used, despite the fact there are multiple places around the world which might call for it to be used, and thus it is at best a reasonable question to ask how effective that mechanism will ever actually be. The third problem, which I think is actually the most important problem of all, is Congress. Everything that we are talking about today, all of the myriad reams of paper that I know I've written and Gordon's written and others have written on how to restructure our government are absolutely, completely meaningless unless and until Congress recognizes what the Defense Department has recognized, what the national security sort of foreign policy lead has recognized, and that is that we must have different structures and, most importantly, different legal mechanisms and different funding mechanisms for our civilians if we were to have a robust enough capability to engage in failed and fragile states for the advancement of U.S. national interests. Our Congress is still, with its current committee structures, and I would even say far more importantly, with a mindset that is still pretty much a Cold War mindset with regard to how we organize our national security community, has yet to adequately wake up to the notion that funding USAID and dramatically increasing its funding and dramatically, not a bit, I mean no joke, honest to goodness, dramatically increasing our personnel and our giving our civilian colleagues the resources, the flexibility of the spending of funds, and the quantity of spending funds that are necessary, and the having multi-year money to be able to engage in these sorts of activities is at least as important to protecting U.S. national security as is promoting missile defense or building additional aircraft carrier battle groups or any number of other things that are in the last $750 billion defense budget. So what we at the Center for American Progress are very deeply engaged in now is trying to figure out how we can move congressional viewpoints on this matter. I think that there's actually a fair amount of research available for how we should organize ourselves as a government, and there is a reasonable difference of opinion on that. But the problem is not a lack of research or a lack of understanding of what needs to be done in the context of our government. The major problem is political will. And the major question, therefore, in my view, is how do we convince individual members of Congress, and particularly the congressional leadership, to take the very bold and revolutionary action that's going to be required to prepare and structure our government for 21st century threats, to include, most prominently, how we deal with failed and fragile states. So with that, I'll yield the floor.
Thank you very much. Very articulate. Gordon, you're next.
Okay. I think what you're going to hear, I'm going to stand up here because I've got a couple of slides to run. This will not be death by PowerPoint. I assure you, there's only 2 slides here. That's quite a distinction. When I was at the Office of Management and Budget, I used to really love it when the Army came over and gave me a briefing. 45 slides, 30 minutes. So I figured the only way that you could really handle that kind of briefing was to start with the first slide and begin asking questions. And eventually, the Army never got to slides 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. But we got some real interesting discussion in, which was good. I think we're going to have violent agreement on a lot of stuff here. Although people may disagree on what the particulars are, I wanted to come at the question from a slightly different angle and then talk about some data and suggest some avenues of approach here. The words matter. And so part of what I wanted to say today is that how we approach what the this is makes a big difference. Because everybody's view, I find, about what is to be done is very heavily influenced about what they think the problem is. And I like very much the direction I think Ruben was heading in what he had to say about what the problem is. I'm not sure we're yet at the answer of how to deal with what the real problem is, because the language goes from post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction to counterinsurgency operations to failed states to fragile states to go on and on. Everybody sort of lists a laundry list of what the problem is, but I think it makes a real difference what we think the real problem is and what it is we think we can do. And the reason I say that is because I think we're in severe danger of learning what I like to call the lessons of the last post-war. The lessons of the last post-war have to do largely with Iraq, partly with Afghanistan, but in both cases, they being the conflicts that we are involved in, the deployments that we have in place, tend to influence our thinking a lot about what we think the problem is and what it is we need to build to deal with what we think the problem is. One might say that we have to be very cautious about those lessons. Iraq, I think, classically in terms of governance, could be considered largely a failure in terms of U.S. policy. We invaded the country. Well, that defines a particular kind of problem. Problems of governance in countries the United States invaded, right? Where we took down a government. Problems of countries in which the United States invaded and took down a government. Where we dismantled a security force. Some people argue it was already dismantled. That's a discussion we can go into if you want to in Q&A. But again, countries the United States invaded, took down a government, and dismantled a security force. And we dismantled a good part of the bureaucracy, the public bureaucracy. So the problem there is countries that we invaded, dismantled the government, took down the security force, and eliminated the bureaucracy. Now that creates a particular kind of governance problem. The question is whether it's the kind of governance problem we need to build a capacity to fix. Or you can take Afghanistan. The Iraq problem means it's real hard, okay? The Afghanistan question, U.S. and in the end NATO joining it, invaded, took down a government, occupied the country, didn't have a bureaucracy worth writing home about. Had a series of warlord-governed areas and a religious mullah-based organization that was ostensibly governing the country. And it had basically no security forces except warlord militias and the Taliban military force. So what the problem there is invading, taking out a country that basically doesn't have a government, doesn't have a security force, and doesn't really have a unified national economy. And that may require a different kind of capacity if you want to build a capacity to solve that kind of governance problem. To add to it that we kind of took our eye off the ball there and booted what may have been some good opportunities to do something about that particular set of parameters while we were on the spot. the bottom line here is, in terms of learning the lessons of the past Cold War, we don't do those two lessons terribly well. We work very hard at them with the best efforts in the world, a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of attention, a lot of effort, not a very good, as Ruben says, track record in terms of what we accomplished. Bottom line number two, and this is a tougher lesson, is we don't do it especially well when it is a responsibility that is largely in the hands of U.S. military forces and the Department of Defense. Play catch-up ball, 3000.05, and all of that to say, well, we didn't do that very well. Let's see what we can build as a capacity to do that. The reality is this is not core mission to the military. Arguably, it's still not core mission to the military. And even more arguably, maybe it shouldn't be core mission to the military. All right? But we literally, by using kinetic capability in some of these circumstances that we're learning the lessons of the last post-war from, shooting ourselves in the foot, literally and figuratively. In terms of our capacity to do what the it is. So whatever it is, coming in and building a capacity that's based around the uses of the military instrument and trying to substitute governance capability that we import from the United States on a civilian basis when we're in a country occupying it or still engaged in kinetic operations may not work very well. It's kind of like, eternal optimism, doing the same thing over and over and over again and hoping the results come out differently. And we're at risk, I would say, without careful thought, of creating a capacity today, following some of the lines Ruben talked about, that will not be able to do it very well in the future. It will be over-militarized. The civilian toolkit will remain relatively weak. And in doing that makes to deal with what it is, we'll make ourselves kind of increasingly or perpetually not terribly popular in the rest of the world, which may have a positive payoff. Fewer and fewer countries may invite us to do it on that basis. So how do we focus this? My view right now is we really have to do some serious thinking about changing the frame here, defining the issue. What is the it we are trying to do? Or what is the range of its? And what is the capacity we need to build in order to do it? And the issue, what I argue, and here I'm in violent agreement with Ruben, is the issue here is fragile and failing states, states with inadequacies and weaknesses of governance. They can't provide adequate security in the country. They can't provide adequate institutions of governance to enable social and economic programs to be undertaken. They cannot develop the economies of their countries. Okay, framed that way, that is a slightly different problem from the it being the government that the United States military took down, eliminated the bureaucracy, eliminated the security forces, and then scrambles to find a way to replace the things that we eliminated and took down. All right? Whether you agree with that was the right thing to do or not, it's not the same problem. And that problem looks a lot more to me like a set of policies, capabilities, contingency funds, programs that we need in order to strengthen not only our capacity to assist the strengthening of governance, and here I would say the objective is governance that is reasonably effective, reasonably efficient, relatively uncorrupt, and reasonably responsive to its citizens. That's the target set I'm interested in. Now, that's just me. You may have another it, but that's my it. That's what the governance problem is about. And if that's true, then this is an issue that is going to require not only a slightly different set of mechanisms in the American government case, but a great deal more multilateral cooperation than we have ever seen or ever imagined. Because we may not be the only capacity, certainly I would say are not, the only capacity that is capable of doing this. Let's take just the one little thing about police training and see who does it well for the gendarme type of police forces. We're not very well skilled at that, but other people are. Building that kind of multilateral capability is a somewhat different issue. So that to me is the problem set. And then if this thing works, and I think it does, I want to talk just a moment about the diaspora. I know you can't read this. It's okay. That means if there's a data error, you won't spot it. This basically says here the fiscal 2010 DoD International Assistance Programs and Authorizations and Appropriations for fiscal year 2010. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm not going to do chapter and verse here. It is to say that what we have built, and I think Ruben's sense of the origin of this is correct, in a sense that the State Department is too poorly organized, too ineffective, too unresponsive, and has too hard a time raising money, we've built an enormous architecture over on the Defense Department side of American government capability to do some parts of these things. But even that is a diaspora. Some of it is about cooperative threats, some about security, some of it's about training for counterinsurgency, some of it's about counter-fellowship training. We've got a huge array of programs, and if you can read even some of the numbers on the rest of the chart, you'll see that the funding in these areas is enormous. All right, so already over in the DoD side, in general, in areas of assistance programs and authorizations of money, we've built a very large architecture similar to right-hand column, programs and authorities that exist in the existing foreign policy architecture of the United States. And this is the origin of Rubin's problem of coordination. This is a big piece of it. And in the area of security, and I'll go up one, stabilization and reconstruction, I mean, these are the spigots between DoD and state, and this is a narrow list, you could go much more broadly than this, that are focused just on stabilization and reconstruction issues. The CERP program, very large. The Combatant Commanders Initiative Fund, not so large, but with an expanding agenda. ODACA, not so large, but an expanding agenda. And over on the civilian side, Office of Transition Initiatives, very, very small. And the Civilian Stabilization Initiative that is being proposed by the administration and being built over at SCRS. And then we got the PRTs, which doesn't even exist as a formal architecture in American government, but is probably the only operating interagency capability in the two countries that we're learning all those lessons from. So we have a real diaspora of capability. And what I want to move to, having just demonstrated those things, is to say, I think the approach to how we deal with the it that I talked about has to take off from a recognition that the it has something to do with a much broader set of problems, that we have a much broader set of tools to deal with. In other words, that failed states is a part of a broader strategy in the near term and in the long term to deal with questions of governance, and those are linked to questions of development in many of these countries. And that our toolkit, looked at that way, our toolkit is largely, should be, non-kinetic. So the military role in providing the fulfillment of that objective is clear and marked in combat scenarios, somewhat distant in almost any other scenario. And as long as we are focused on building a military capability to expand its reach, see the slides, we're going to go down a road that is counterproductive to achieving the it that I am talking about. And that means doing some particular things. I would say, both on the civilian and on the military side, that I think DoD is the wrong place to build this capability. I would also argue, and we'll be happy to take questions on it, that SCRS may be in part the wrong place too. But here's what I would just in brief suggest we should think about. And here I will add to what Ruben said, because I think he's right about what the Congress needs to think about. The executive branch needs to think about it too. And right now we've got a lot of thinking on the DoD side, and we're not yet rich in thinking on the State Department, USAID, or NSC sides. So at the same meeting that I was at, that Lisa was at today, what you got was, yeah, but the State Department doesn't seem to know what it wants to do. Real problem. DoD knows what it wants to do. State Department doesn't seem to know what it wants to do. So there's an executive branch problem. First off, just some guidelines off the top of my head on the military side in DoD. If the objective is governance as I defined it, in fragile, failed states, post-conflict states, and the like, then one of the tools that we need to restrict very heavily and not put into permanent law is CERP. Because CERP is a pure military delivery capability with virtually no formal role for the diplomatic institutions of the United States to play. And as you looked at the data on the chart and could read it, a rapidly growing source of funding for this kind of activity. The overall CERP program begins to compete with bilateral DA from USAID. All right, so the Combatants Emergency Response, Commander's Emergency Response Program is one area to focus in on and say, well, now wait a minute, are we building the right tool, and is that tool in the right place for us to be effective in meeting that objective? Secondly, on the civilian side, I think there's a role here for thinking about a slightly different architecture than what we're building. I think Ruben's right. SCRS is not in a very strong position to coordinate the rest of the executive branch of the United States government. And anybody who served in the United States government, I have, will tell you that a second level down, assistant secretary level office in the State Department is going to have a heck of a hard time coordinating anybody else in the federal government. It's just the way it is, folks. You know, if people resist DOD coordinating the federal government, welcome to the interagency battle. I'll come back to NSC in a minute. The operators, the delivery potential capability in the civilian side of government with respect to near-term governance intervention is at USAID. And this is a heretical thought in a town obsessed by strengthening SCRS. But in fact, the capability is at USAID. And re-engineering and rebuilding a capability in an institution most of whose culture is devoted to represent, report, and negotiate is not a strong hand. And it's one of the reasons it's having trouble on the Hill. It's because it's very, very hard to build there. But as part of building a stronger capacity at USAID, those folks, through OTI, through disaster resistance, through humanitarian relief programs, through the Conflict Mitigation Office, actually have a small but real operating on-the-ground field capability for doing this kind of thing. And as Ruben said, a fragile state strategy on top of it. So my thinking is, let's exploit that instrument. Let's build and really develop a strong and capable instrument there. But that doesn't mean the State Department doesn't have a role. Somebody asked me today, are you really saying you want to protect these programs by putting them at USAID instead of state? No. The state clearly has a role. This is a policy-driven problem. It's a policy-driven agenda, and state is a policy organization. State Department clearly, either through SCRS or through SCRS in combination with the regional bureaus, ought to be focused on thinking about what regions, what countries, what problems, how do we go about it, how do we target it, how does it fit with American foreign policy objectives, our strategic goals, how do we turn the problem of fragility and weak governance around with our instruments and in cooperation with others. So there's a very strong State Department role, could be a strong SCRS role. And third, to come to the executive branch, right now, I think Ruben's dead on target. The NSC has not yet grappled with this issue. It really needs to, I think, with urgency. What kind of a senior structure in the NSC is needed, both to think through the broad strategy guidelines for this and, seriously, to conduct the oversight of operations? Not to conduct operations. This isn't about an operational NSC. It's about the oversight of operations. Now, having served in the executive branch and having been involved in discussions about oversight of operations that were underway at the time, Haiti, Rwanda, Balkans, that is a clear function for the National Security Council to undertake and needs, I would say, to be more institutionalized. And the last piece, and then I'll get whisked off stage.
Yes, 1 minute.
Is contingency funding. This is the big sticking point for the Hill. The big sticking point is there a way, once you've built this credible capability to deal with the it that I was describing, how do you take the flexibility of a SERP or the flexibility of a 1207 and create that possibility in the Function 150 International Affairs budget account as a contingency fund. Now, the House Foreign Affairs Committee State Authorization Bill tries to get, Foreign Affairs Authorization Bill tries to get at this. I think it's underfunded, not yet a fully designed option, but clearly something that needs to be done in a conversation between the executive branch and the legislature so that both are willing to sign off on the package. So those are just a few guidelines. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Dane Smith.
Thank you. Perhaps the violent agreement is going to stop with me, although in many aspects of the principles of the issues, I think we are in agreement. I'm going to talk a little bit about organization and how it has happened. There's been a lot of organization and reorganization over the past few years, really since 2004. And the question is, what is the relevance of it to the present administration? And of course, as we all know, the Bush 43 administration attacked nation building. That was a Clintonian doctrine applied to the Balkans. And so the watchword for the Bush administration, both for Afghanistan and Iraq, was no nation building. But then the violent insurgency in Iraq resulted in a 180-degree turn, so that when you get to 3000.05 directive coming out of DOD, which says that stability operations shall be given priority comparable to combat operations, and you ask what are stability operations, you read their stability operations are conducted to help establish order. The immediate goal is to provide the local populace with security, secure long-range essential services, meet humanitarian needs, but the long-term goal is to help develop indigenous capacity for a viable market economy, rule of law, democratic institutions, and a robust civil society. So it was really a re-embrace of Clintonian nation building at its most comprehensive. And the words about priority comparable to combat operations came out of the mouth of Donald Rumsfeld. And the Pentagon really went quite far in mainstreaming this through a good bit of the building. And in 2008, stability operations became Army doctrine, Army Field Manual 3.07. First organizational point. Second, with SCRS. The decision to create SCRS was nested in the whole idea that after Iraq 2003, the Secretary of State would be given authority to coordinate and lead all U.S. government agencies in reconstruction and stabilization, and that was enshrined about a year and a half after the creation of SCRS in National Security Presidential Directive 44. And I think that decision recognized that reconstruction and stabilization are closer to diplomatic than military operations. To draw up a balance sheet for SCRS, first was the creation by 2007 of the Interagency Management System. That has never been invoked, it's true. It's been used. Something like it was used in the Georgia crisis, and several exercises have been patterned on it, but it's never been used per se, so we don't know whether it's going to work. But at least a system is in place, and it's a fairly sophisticated approach. The other achievement of SCRS, major achievement, is the launching of the civilian expeditionary capacity based on the idea of an active component, a standby component, and then the civilian reserve. And the active component has been out there with people sent to Darfur, Lebanon, Kosovo, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Pretty modest numbers overall. The civilian reserve was basically left to the new Congress, and it has to decide what to do with it. On the negative side, SCRS has suffered from anemic financing. The State Department didn't set aside any money out of its budget initially, so SCRS went from hand to mouth for several years. In 2007, President Bush called for the enactment of the civilian reserve, but there wasn't any money behind it in the 2008 budget. A slight lacuna there. So far, the Congress has, it wasn't until FY 2009, the last lame duck budget of the Bush administration, that $250 million were proposed to expand civilian response and create the reserve. And thus far, the Congress, through 2 supplemental appropriations, has provided about half of that, basically to pump up the active and standby components. And the only project money, as has been alluded to, for SCRS during this time came, yes, from the the Defense Department, these Section 1207 grants of about $100 million a year. Second big problem for SCRS has been the cloud of the geographic bureaus. Now, traditionally, it has been states' geographic bureaus that have done most of the peace-building diplomacy of the United States. I mean, we're not talking about Iraq and Afghanistan or Bosnia, basically, but most of the peace-building diplomacy has been done by these bureaus, and the reason for that is pretty logical. It's they that know the local situation in the countries of concern. The problem is that political officers in the State Department are not trained in conflict. I mean, when I was asked to be the special presidential envoy for Liberia, nobody ever asked me if I'd had any training in conflict. Wouldn't have even occurred to them. I was handy, and so they made that appointment. So they're untrained, and the bureaus don't welcome new actors in their crises. So when Lebanon erupted in 2006 and Somalia in 2007, the coordinator's office was largely blocked by the geographic bureaus. Now, they've been active in some areas like Kosovo, where they deployed temporary staff to the new embassy in Pristina, and they've done modeling, important modeling for the Congolese election, for example, and they've managed, using 1207 funds, projects in places like Haiti and Nepal and the Congo and Lebanon. But, of course, SCRS never did assume a significant role in Afghanistan and Iraq. Originally, Colin Powell warned it away from those countries, said with some logic that if they got in there right away, they would be swamped and founder. But 5 years later, we're left with the disturbing question of why didn't it grow into a major role in those two key places. In AID, some important, very important developments. Andrew Natsios changed the Bureau of Humanitarian Response into the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Affairs. He created the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, and very important parts of the U.S. government toolbox have come out of that small office. The Conflict Assessment Framework, which was the foundation for the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework, which has been approved now. The CAF was applied to 40 different country programs, and the military leaped on it and changed and adapted it to become the tactical conflict assessment framework for Afghanistan. And the tool kits like land and conflict, youth and conflict, etc., have been very helpful in defining how you approach issues of that sort. And I would argue that CMM has become the office within the U.S. government most tightly focused on conflict prevention as opposed to post-conflict reconstruction. Okay, coming down with some recommendations. I believe that the Secretary of State should retain the lead in coordinating post-conflict reconstruction. I think the Bush administration got that right, that it's closer to diplomacy than military operations, reconstruction and stabilization. So we have somewhat of a disagreement there. And I think that SCRS should be basically her staff for that role. But the Secretary's commitment is absolutely essential to whether this is going to work. And frankly, SCRS did not get the commitment of Secretary Rice. Otherwise, when the crises emerge, SCRS is elbowed aside by the geographic bureaus. And that requires working out complementarity, as I think it was Gordon mentioned. There needs to be a complementarity between these two entities, SCRS and the geographic bureaus. If you leave the geographic bureaus out, you're going to make some really stupid mistakes about context. You'll get the context wrong. But on the other side, SCRS, with its planning, its expeditionary work, and its projects, now has a basis on which to play a larger role. Now, very important to this really is a different approach in the State Department to training political officers. The protocols for promotion, the promotion precepts should be changed so that if you're a political officer, you need to serve in a conflict area or you don't get promoted. And if you're going to be up for DCM or up for country director in a certain kind of area that's conflict filled, you need to punch these cards before you're considered seriously for those positions. Another recommendation is that my view is how you deal with this problem of operations is that SCRS should become a fully integrated state USAID operation. Now, it started a bit in that direction. I mean, the first coordinator, Carlos Pascual, came out of USAID. He was a USAID officer. They've had one deputy coordinator who's a USAID officer. But if you look on the staffing list, there's nobody else from USAID. Now, there may be reasons for that, but they should be easy to overcome. I would say up to a third of SCRS positions, substantive positions, should be USAID officer to inject that operational depth and convey a message of commitment to operational capability. Now, one point I want to make, a kind of an aside on that, and that is that this notion that State Department only does policy and only does policy planning and does representation and reporting overlooks the fact that a lot of the functional bureaus have been doing operations for a long time. Refugees, democracy and governance, all of these which are quite relevant to the post-conflict reconstruction process. So I think that there are possibilities for SCRS to play an important operational role with the support of the Secretary of State and with an integrated state aid operation. I agree that with respect to DOD, there's been so much emphasis on the role of the military in this process that I think it overlooks the unlikelihood that we're going to see DOD deployed in a lot of different places doing stability operations. To me, that's not plausible. I don't think the American people want it. I don't think the Congress wants it. So probably this worry that DOD with all these financial and personnel resources is going to take over this function is overplayed. Those of us who've been involved on the Africa side know that DOD has been very reluctant to get into Africa, for heaven's sake. There were fights over this in the previous administrations. They get involved where the stakes are very, very high, and that's usually not the case in Africa. So I think we are talking about basically the coordination of the civilian side. And I think that for operations on the ground, my notion of an integrated state aid operation in SCRS would include integrating CMM to take over the conflict prevention operation of SCRS, and also integrating the Office of Transition Initiatives. Now, talk about the group that is an expeditionary force that is battle-trained, operating in the Balkans, operating in Iraq and Afghanistan. That is OTI. Why shouldn't OTI be the foundation for the active component of the response corps? So I think I will stop there. And
all right. Thank you so much, each of you. Let's hear from the audience. What are your questions? The gentleman in the back. Is there a microphone? There you go. The gentleman in the back. Can you raise your hand again? Okay.
Chairman, freelance correspondent. I plan to say this for next session, but in my think this session really is meat of today's discussion. And if you say no political will, I don't think so, because invasion is not a simple thing. So we support the invasion, and also look this so-called stabilization and reconstruction. We give this so much money and so many programs. So there's a political will. The thing is this: we give too much for the Department of Defense. I think we should look the mission and function of Department of Defense. Military action is for destruction and destabilization.
Can you come to the question that you have for the panel? Is there a question?
Yeah, there's a question.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this the problem over there in Iraq and Afghanistan is reflect the problem here. So simple thing is this. There's a government problem here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I didn't hear a question. I didn't hear a question. Okay. Gentleman over here.
John Harbison Zeiss. I didn't hear, I like a lot of what Dane Smith said, but what I didn't hear from really any of you is how DOD and state aid are going to collaborate. Ruben, for you, it sounded from your standpoint like state and aid and Congress are not ready for prime time. And Dane was talking about conflict within the framework of state and aid without any reference to DOD. This does not sound to me like 3 Ds at all, let alone the 4th D of democratization, which I won't get. That's next question.
Okay, who would like to take that?
Well, let me say this. There certainly is collaboration between DOD, state, and aid that is happening. Whether you want to talk about, for example, the senior development advisors that AID has sent out to all the combatant commands, who are essentially the development equivalent to the POLADs, or you take a look at, for example, what's happening at the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, where it's basically a military command, but they have representations through all the USAID missions. If you like, I could sort of go on and on. What is not happening, in my view, is either our civilian agencies, principally state and aid, having the flexibility and the quantity of resources to be effective partners with regard to our military allies. Let me sort of give you sort of an example of what I mean. In November, I had a Marine Corps infantry captain come talk to me. He had been assigned to U.S. Africa Command. He was telling me a story that happened towards the end of the fiscal year in 2008. When they were coming to the end of fiscal year, as you know, you have to spend all your money at the end of fiscal year. You don't get any more money. And he was told by his boss, like, look, we have $500,000 of extra, like ODACA money or something to go spend. I need you to go fly down to N'Djamena in Chad and go find a way to spend this $500,000 on ODACA projects for the next 3 weeks. To a Marine Corps infantry captain. Marines are nice. Good guy, reasonably well educated, but not a development expert. And there are, development experts who are sitting here in this room who have decades more experience to be able to do that kind of work, and yet they can't deviate more than a couple of $1,000s from their heavily earmarked budgets that they have every single year. Those kinds of mixed matches make it impossible for us to have a fully integrated operational plan linked to a broader strategy for how we're going to deal with failed and fragile states. And that's why I think all this comes ultimately back to Congress, which goes back to the question the gentleman was raised before. Unless we are able to have the dramatic political will to reform our legal architecture, to make our civilian agencies the equivalent partners that they need to be with regard to the assets they're giving the Defense Department, collaboration cannot happen on an equal and meaningful level, in my view.
Can I just address it slightly differently? I don't think you've defined what the it is. Right. I don't think if it's my it, then the central question for me is less collaboration between state and the military, but instead how you develop the civilian capability to deal with failed and fragile states and governance. Collaboration with the military may be a piece that comes from that if there is an appropriate role for the military in dealing with those kinds of problems. But defined as the problem being collaboration says that the it is situations in which the United States military is or will be deployed. Now, let me point out that here I will slightly disagree with Dane. The United States military is not only deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Africa is one of the places where it is deployed. And there is a great deal of interest in the military, in its involvement in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in the Trans-Sahel region, in the creation of AFRICOM. There's a great deal of involvement and a great deal of interest. The concern, both in African countries and in the civilian side of the American government, is that military agenda driving the civilian engagement of the United States in those areas. The problem there is not collaborating with the military view of what its mission is in AFRICOM. The problem is the coordination and development of what Ruben is talking about, sufficiently flexible and creative instruments on the civilian side, not necessarily with the goal of collaboration with the military, though that could follow from a strengthened civilian capability, but in addressing the it that I'm talking about, which is the problem of fragile states and failed and fragile states and governance in many regions of the world, which are a concern of the United States national security policy. So the it makes a difference here. And if the lesson that we've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan is, my God, we don't have an adequate civilian capability to go in with the military and deal with post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction. The it is not what is U.S. national security policy with respect to failed, failing, fragile states and governance.
Okay.
Just a couple of points. There is, of course, as Ruben said, collaboration between SCRS and the military. It's seen most clearly with their work with the Joint Forces Command, which is now includes civilian cooperation in its idea of jointness. And also, of course, CRS will tell you that it worked very closely with the Army in the construction of the Army Field Manual on Stability Operations. But that doesn't solve the main point, which is more of an operational one. Coming to the issue of SERP, which Gordon pointed to, I think, very tellingly, we need some kind of civilian equivalent of the SERP, perhaps which would be in the hands of the chief of mission for use in a conflict country. It's hard to believe that the same kind of magnitudes would be provided unless the Congress can get at this issue of this extreme imbalance between civilian and military resources. The third point simply is that AFRICOM may have changed the equation somewhat in Africa. I'm doubtful of that, particularly with the great start it got off to. And certainly it is deeply involved in things that are related to the war on terror. But to have it, to see it get more completely involved in real problems of post-conflict reconstruction like Sudan and Congo, I have my doubts.
All right, thank you. We're going to take the last two questions here, and then Neil Levine over here. So.
My name is Mohammed Qasim, and I've been involved in development in too many years. Seems to be the problem here is focus and coordination. Why don't we now focus on Pashtunistan, what is wrongly called AFPAC? Today's Financial Times says the refugees are now 3 million, and they're streaming out at the rate of 100,000 a day. Can't the greatest military power in the world, who is defeating itself in Afghanistan, focus on this issue and see that we do something before it spills over? And what is called Pakistan, which after all is a creation of two Brits, one called Radcliffe, the other one called Durand, draw those lines and call that a nation. You cannot call that a nation. That is a fragile state. In fact, all the imperial legacies are fragile states.
Okay, so the IDP crisis in Pakistan and the humanitarian. Okay, and Neil, if we can have your question and then get answers here.
Neil Levine, USAID, joined the Alliance for Violent Agreement for much of what we've heard. What I didn't hear, I heard less of, I guess, and it might have to do with the topic of the panel, but I'd be interested in hearing from each of the panelists on more of the role of diplomacy. If the military should get out of the civilian role and aid deliver, and aid should be made more robust to play that role, that to me suggests that the role is really on the upstream conflict prevention and diplomacy. But what are the recommendations in that area from the panel?
Okay, Ruben, are you ready to go?
Sure. I think there's no question that the IDP crisis in Pakistan is profound, of enormous proportions. There's also no question that it has potential to fundamentally destabilize Pakistan, and for both clearly humanitarian reasons, both with regard to the nature of the flows, and also for incredibly important geostrategic reasons, we need to be heavily engaged. Now, that said, I noticed there's a camera in the back of the room. I assume it's recording. So let me just say that I think it's important too. and leave it there. On the question of I think Neil raised a very sort of good question with regard to the role of diplomacy, and I think the way I'm not an expert in diplomatic practice, but what I think I gather from your question is what should be different about how we're using our diplomatic instrument in these spaces, and I think that from my view, we are very, very good at high-level, bilateral, multilateral representations, and we are reasonably good at reporting. I think that where we need to be much better, it was for sort of a lack of a better phrase of saying it, is sort of tactical diplomacy, and that is being able to have officers that are engaging with local populations. I mean, you think about, for example, some of the work, for example, that human terrain teams are doing with anthropologists in Afghanistan. I don't understand why that's not a basic diplomatic function. I don't understand why trying to sort of gain greater insight into these sorts of individual networks of people in various parts of the world, whether it's related to Al-Qaeda or whether it's related to some other sort of political movements, ought to be at the core of what our diplomats are able to do, in addition to what we're able to do with regard to sort of more traditional representation and reporting. So from my view, that's how I'd answer it.
Let me just tackle briefly each of them. Let me stipulate, as with Ruben, that it's an important problem in Pakistan. But I want to point out that Pakistan, to me, is a classic case of the difficulties of imagining these problems as a military skill set. We don't have the kinds of military options in Pakistan that we thought we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our political relationship with the country is different. The receptivity of the population to any American military engagement is substantially different. And therefore, the toolkit that we ought to have developed and ought to be developing in Pakistan is not the toolkit that we've actually spent upwards of $10 billion on since 2001, which is essentially kinetic activity and support for Pakistani military kinetic activity and reimbursements, so-called, budget subsidies to the government of Pakistan over the past 8 years that haven't produced any particularly positive result as a consequence. And we're right in the middle of this kind of struggle about Pakistan with respect to authorities in the American government as we speak, which is who has policy responsibility and authority over the Pakistani Counterinsurgency Capabilities Fund. Is that going to be pursuant to foreign policy direction? Is it going to be a pure military training program? And to what end? What leads us to believe that we have the capacity to effectively train the Pakistanis in counterinsurgency operations and produce an effective result? That question is not being answered. So Pakistan is a very classic case, I think, of the wrong instruments wrongly applied with the wrong lessons learned. With respect to diplomacy, there's a lot we could say. In fact, I was going to say, if you're interested in the data that I presented here, or in general in the work that we're doing at the Stimson Center in this area, there's some publications that we'll have outside after we've broken the session for you can pick up, or you can go to www.stimson.org/budgeting, and you'll see a lot of this on there. One thing that's on there is a study we did last October with the American Academy of Diplomacy, which starts to address that question, which is what needs to happen, hands-on, serious, detailed, in the diplomatic side of the American capability, the civilian toolkit. How many people do we need to add? What kind of training do we need to give those people? How do we get enough people in that you can do a training component? And to pick up on some of the ideas that have been suggested by my other panelists here, to talk about how we create the Foreign Service officer of the future who can walk and chew gum at the same time, who reports, represents, and negotiates well, can also develop, implement, oversee, and evaluate programs, has gone through a diplomatic cone, has gone through a Justice Department cone, has gone through a Department of Defense or an NSC level experience, and gets promoted because they've done that kind of thing. We have to create a new diplomat in order to service this requirement that we have on the civilian side. So there's an important answer to that question. The Congress is to some degree responding on the people's side and the numbers side. We still got a long way to go on the training and skill set side so that the people that we bring into the State Department, and here I have to say I agree in part with what Dane said, a lot of people at the State Department are doing program. A large number of those people, frankly, Dane, are civilian civil servants. They are not, in fact, FSOs. That the FSO stovepipe is still pretty much, in that report, represent and negotiate stovepipe in the State Department. We need to broaden that out and take advantage, I agree with you, what's being done programmatically at State, so that we reward people who know how to do all of those skill sets, and those are our diplomats of the future.
Okay, thank you so much for laying this out. We've concluded here on our panel. I believe we're turning it over now. Howard, Michael, are you coming up now? Are we taking a break? We'll go straight into it. So please stay in your seats.
Hold those seats.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glad you used the word this building too.
Thank you.
So send me that.
Thank you. I resonate with what you said.
Well, so it's not like I object to the military rules. Yeah. Now how do I get out of this thing? What do you say? There we go.
This is hooked up to the internet, right? Which is, oh, okay, yes, I got it.
So, it could be that, just go for it, as long as people feel like
You're not even want to do this other than just going to be a couple of short sentences at the airport.
well,
Yeah.
as we build it,
See what comes. The thing that's saying, you can make the observation joke you have. Obviously, people have had a lot.
You may have some observations.
Well,
Well, obviously, we're at a time of the week when it is not exactly favorable to further discussion after a pretty intense day. So we needn't keep this going till 5:15, which is what the schedule actually says. But you're here, and you must be motivated for being here. So what we had in mind for this session, and sometimes a smaller group is better for this, is just to kind of retrieve some of the most striking insights that occurred to you, things you may have thought about differently, both in terms of kind of the nature of the problem, how to think about the problem, but also in terms of the whole side of how one responds in countries or organizationally to this phenomenon of fragile and failed states. The floor is open for any, I mean, this is the chance for, nobody's going to hold you to what you're saying here. So, wild thoughts, creative ones, but wild. Yeah, David.
microphone coming here, David. Oh.
And we can make this as much of a discussion because we're sort of small and it's not that big a room.
Well, one of your reference points in the preamble to the agenda was smart power. I don't know if that ever came up in any of the discussions, but it strikes me after having listened to the last panel that, well, where to begin? I come from a country where you could say resources are in short supply for this kind of engagement, and leadership, you might also say, is in short supply, given that we have a minority government in power. What I heard wasn't a problem of leadership or capacity. In other words, all three agencies, government departments are well funded, and there's no shortage of leadership if we define it in terms of the experience that the United States has had abroad in failed and fragile states in any capacity you want to define over the last 15 to 20 years. What do we mean then by smart power? What I gather from today's discussion is it really needs to be driven by a better analytical framework. I know that sounds self-serving, being an academic, but I think, Michael, what you've sort of led us to believe, if not agree on, is that diagnostic work really needs to precede the search for solutions. It isn't enough, I think, to provide a set of incentive structures. What we heard in the last panel, I think, is a problem that's being visited upon by all countries that are involved in fragile and failed states work, whether it's Canada, the UK, and so on. Each of them are trying to grapple with this fundamental problem of bureaucratic stovepiping and infighting. And essentially what you see are the departments trying to relate to one another in a way that they're not capable of doing. Lawrence Wucher's written extensively on the problem of political will, and it really comes down to the issue of leadership within the government. I think that leadership really has to be paramount when you discuss the problem of engaging in fragile, failed states. But I do want to make the point that putting diagnostic work at the beginning and then deciding on priorities at both the strategic and tactical level or the operational level is absolutely essential. And we may take this as a common point of reference for the kind of work we do, but I think 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, it was a foreign process. I think within, whether it was USAID or CETA, where I come from, or State Department, so on, the idea that you would situate a country within the context of fragility, failure, or conflict, I think was a new one. And I don't think we're far enough along to really appreciate the difficulties in understanding the relationship between fragility and failure, and how third parties can engage in those kinds of problems. So, if I were to make a policy recommendation, it would be that these departments find a common analytical framework that comes from the highest level of strategic decision making, is informed by all departments, and reflects all their analyses and interests and assessments of the situation. I don't know the extent to which that exists currently in this government, but my sense is, based on what I heard in the last panel, it's if it does exist, it's not sufficient to coordinate or provide a basis or an impetus for having these departments to work together. You would think that analysis alone should be sufficient, that essentially it would identify the priority areas in which this country could engage. But somehow that's not working. Everybody thinks they have a role to play. Well, sometimes they don't have a role to play, or the role they have to play will come later on.
Okay, thanks. Howard is
your comment, David,
motivated.
Provokes some reactions on my side, not in terms of disagreement with the broad concept, but with an observation from my own time in diplomacy and on the policymaking side, that if you're ever going to create that system that is more responsive to the real challenges, you've got to almost begin from scratch with a very different paradigm. What's happening now is whenever we sit down to talk about how to reorganize more effectively, we're constantly thinking in structural and institutional terms. How do you bring various agencies of government that have prescribed functions together to develop a more holistic approach? And what we neglect from the very beginning is the core problem, which is working in divided societies. And one of the reasons we don't deal with that core issue of looking at this from the standpoint of the societies we're trying to engage, we begin instead with institutions that we're familiar with, is because of the training problems that Dane mentioned. I mean, I think it is shocking that diplomats are not trained in conflict transformation or in mediation or in facilitation. They're trained in how to exercise tools of diplomacy, which are sticks and carrots, and which presuppose that the diplomatic or international role is to use, as has been said on many occasions here, carrots and sticks. We know how to create certain kinds of incentives. We know how to put certain kinds of pressure on folks. At the end of the day, if you're talking about societies in which there is no common sense of nationhood, in which there is no sense of interdependence, in which people do not feel connected to one another, and there's no value attached to collaboration, no consensus on the rules of the game, etc., etc., you need a totally different set, different kinds of skill sets to address those issues, and a different kind of training that prepares diplomats to actually do the work of diplomacy, which they're not trained to do now. I mean, that's kind of a broad reaction, but I've been very frustrated over the years I've been involved. When I used to talk when I was a diplomat, serving as a special envoy, and I would raise with my colleagues the notion of trying to bring key leaders together and do some training and give them some capacity to begin to take ownership of their own situation, eyes would glaze over. I mean, literally, within the State Department. Now that we've had some experience in this, there is beginning to be some traction. But that is, you've got to retrain people. You've got a different paradigm that begins. I think the starting point should be, what are the fundamental challenges faced in a divided society in terms of state building?
Pardon? Yeah, Rebecca.
That's a perfect segue to my question, which is kind of leftover from session A, where you introduced.
Could you mention your?
I'm Rebecca de Guzman, and I work in support of the Marine Corps. And Mr. Wolpe talked about leadership training, and you're talking about that now. And it sounds like, certainly. You've had some success, or the program, you described some successes, and the way I understand it is this has been run through the center here, and maybe there are some other examples. I'm curious about if there's a capacity for that within the USG, and if there isn't, where it might be resident, or where you think it could and should be developed. And then I have another question, which is unrelated, but I'm curious if you've explored the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework, the ICAF, which is like this enlightened tool which draws upon a lot of the elements which you mentioned in your talk at Session A, such as key leaders and identifying these collaborative points and building, mitigating factors, this sort of thing. So.
Yeah. Well, very quickly on the first point, I would just reiterate what Dane observed. Your body of expertise, and where you have people that are familiar with the kind of stuff I was sharing, is located in CMM, Conflict Mitigation and Management. The tragedy right now is that those folks are kind of over there on the side, treated almost as a bureaucratic frill like any other development program. That would be nice if we could do a little conflict transformation work, but which has never been viewed as central to the diplomatic mission, which is why I was so enthusiastic with Dane's suggestion that that work of CCM bureaucratically and functionally should be tightly integrated with state, and whether it's through the Office of Stabilization and Reconstruction, but needs to be tightly integrated with all activities related to peace building, in my view. Now, I haven't looked recently at the conflict. I've seen it in the past. But, yeah, that's where the point about having these frameworks can be a very useful guide. But you have to get out of this kind of structural straitjacket in which we're looking at things in very, very institutional terms without looking at the social, psychological, human dimension of transformation.
Yeah, I was thinking of some points that really follow nicely on several of these that have been made so far. I was struck by, when Gordon Adams was speaking, a person who, he's not here anymore, I don't think, not that it matters, but a person who spent years and years dealing with the very nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of the mechanics of budgeting in the federal government and so on in relation to defense and other areas at OMB and so on. Nevertheless, sort of focused on this problem of what is the conception of the problem. You know, he said words matter and so on. And apparently I was going to ask him this if there was an opportunity. Apparently he was viewing clarity on what is the problem as being one of the things that, if it were resolved, would have some influence in itself. In other words, the influence in a way of ideas and information and, as several people have put it just now, analysis. David was saying, you know, a central role needs to be given to, or could be given to, diagnostics, and that would help to drive the not just the thinking but the action, and help perhaps. And here's where I run into problems. There was a lot throughout the day. There was considerable coherence, despite some disagreements or different nuances, in the first two panels of the day, which were largely analytical. The one about the global scan and the various PowerPoints about ranking of fragile states and so on, and the one that I was on with Jim Dobbins in terms of what are we learning in terms of what works best first and second and third and so on. The dissonance started to occur, and then in the three breakout groups, I was only in one of them and a little bit in another, but I sent, actually the one that I was in was on the basic services, which was embarking on rather innovative thinking. So it doesn't necessarily reflect I mean, it's really leading edge stuff, really very new ideas, this whole notion of hybrid polities or hybrid political orders. But I think in all of those, there's a certain dynamism, intellectual dynamism, and potential for coherence and so on. The dissonance started to occur when we shifted to the multilateral subject and to the last one of the day, the U.S. government. In other words, the mechanics, the organizational, the institutional issues. So the question in my mind is, and Lisa, maybe you have some ideas here, just as the National Defense Education Act and other initiatives in our country have been promoted under the rubric of national defense, and maybe we'd call it security now, and yet were civilian functions. Is there any promise in the fact that, after all, some of the best thinking on some of these subjects just in the last few years has been generated by the Defense Department? Not all of it. CMM and so on has been working on this for some time. Not to mention the Institute of Peace, Lawrence. But is there any political potential for a better, clearer conceptualization of the problem, being fragile states, etc., however we want to put it semantically, as the kind of driver of the politics of sorting out some of these organizational and budgetary questions? Could you remember, actually, Lisa and I gave some testimony at the House Armed Services Committee 3 weeks ago or so, and I think we both were struck. We sort of made the argument or made the presentation about the non-military approaches to phase zero. What's going on out there in terms of diplomacy and development in early stage situations, conflict situations or pre-conflict situations? I was quite struck that the congressmen, including some Republicans, were basically on board with that idea. Yes, we need to do these sorts of things. Their problem was, and they were asking us for answers to this question, was how do you sell this to the American public? And so I'm just wondering whether there's any leverage here in the idea of selling the problem definition under the rubric of national security, harnessing the energy and the dynamism of DOD, which seems to be quite evident now, in that effort to clarify some of these issues and basically disseminate a more coherent conception of the problem. Is there any payoff politically from that kind of approach, which is somewhat, abstract and conceptual, but I'm just wondering I mean, we don't seem to be left with much else here. Long question, comment. Okay, John, and then that gentleman there. Go ahead.
I want to come back to what I raised the last session. I thought the game was that everybody recognizes that the resource imbalance between DOD and everybody else is part of the problem. And what I'm hearing here, especially from the last panel, is that the non-DOD players are not ready for prime time for bureaucratic reasons, resource reasons, numbers reasons, whatever. And I think that sells that side short. Okay, I've had 2 terms in AID as well as my academic career, so I have a little sense of that. There are a lot of people and a lot of resources over the last quarter of a century just in the AID framework that bear on these kinds of questions. And not only that, but I can't speak for the states much, but for AID has always drawn heavily on its own civil society in this country, including the academy. And Howard's work does not come out of nowhere. There's a huge literature on conflict management, good literature on conflict management, I know he's drawn on. So I think that this conversation is selling short the non-DOD resources we have on this problem and frustrating what I thought was the effort to make the 3 Ds work together. I happen to be interested in I'm an Africanist. I'm really interested in what AFRICOM is doing in the Horn of Africa. And they're charting a very large role that goes well beyond conflict per se. And I just think we're selling the non-DOD resources that we have very short. And I worry about the consequences of that.
Yes, sir. In the back.
I'm Mark Naterno, Interactivity Foundation. I was interested in what you were saying, Michael, about...
What was that again?
Mark Naterno, Interactivity Foundation.
Okay.
I'm interested in what you were saying about the, and I think it was Gordon Adams was his name, who was talking about what the it is and what the problem is. And it was interesting when he was talking about it because he was focusing upon fragile states as the problem. And when you were talking about it, you were interpreting it as national security as the problem. And these are of course, related, but different problems. And if we focus upon fragile states as the problem, then it would seem to me that we're going to direct our resources and our efforts, our money and our personnel over there. If we focus upon national security as the problem, well, that's one way of addressing it. The problem is national security, but there may be other ways of addressing it as well. And I think that it may be a safe bet that focusing all of the resources over there may be a far greater problem to solve. For all of the reasons that you've been talking about, I was not here for a good part of the day, but in the first session and the last sessions, these are the difficult things to solve because we don't have an understanding of the cultures, we don't know our way around. I spent 5 years over in Eastern Central Europe for George Soros and the Soros Foundations doing projects, and we ran into this all the time. We didn't understand what the ends were and what the means for getting to those ends were. And it seems to me that if we're focusing upon national security, and that has to be why fragile states would pose a problem, otherwise fragile states might be in our interest. But if it poses a problem to our national security, it's not. And then the question arises, well, what is the best way of solving that problem, our national security? And the question is focusing upon fragile states the best way? is focusing upon democratization the best way? I tend to think that there's a great division between people who regard democratization as an end in itself, which has always struck me as strange because we think of democracy as a form of government and government as a necessary evil, so how does it become an end in itself? Or do we want to focus upon the sort of, I think, opening societies that I think Jack Goldstone was talking about this morning? That's a different thing. That there may be relationships between them, but they're entirely different things. You can have open societies that are not democratic. You can have democratic societies that are far from open. And so I think that it's very important to think about what the problem is, but I would rethink where Gordon Adams was focusing upon. That may be the possibility, but I think you want to think further than that.
Okay. Please. Lawrence and Lisa, I hope you have something to say eventually. Go ahead.
Thanks. Lawrence Wuscher, U.S. Institute of Peace. I've sort of a partially formed reflection, again, on this conceptualization of what the problem is and then the relationship to how we think about organizing the U.S. government. And I guess as I think about it, the phenomenon of weak and failing states, I mean, it could be that state structures are weakening. It could be that the governance challenges are rising. And I tend to think it's maybe more likely the latter. And it seems reasonable to expect that the governance challenges to states and any other kind of governance structures are going to continue to increase and maybe change more rapidly as we go forward. This thought is also informed by Ken Menkhaus's discussion in our breakout about these kind of non-state governance structures, and the possibility that our assumption that the state is and will always be basically the predominant governance structure everywhere around the world may not be terribly well founded, even in what the reality is today in many parts of the world. If you then step back to how we then organize the U.S. government for the challenges that we face out there, if it's sort of a more general question of rapidly evolving challenges to governance in different places around the world, it strikes me that, yeah, the question of balance between civilian and military and the way in which everybody works together is important, but the fundamental issue is adaptability and dynamism and flexibility to the new and rapidly evolving and not well understood challenges that will continue to face us, whether they look like challenges of weak and failing states, whether it looks like some new phenomenon of global networks of some kind, or interaction between environmental and population effects, or a whole bunch of things that we could think of, and then a whole bunch of things we probably can't anticipate very well. Our government and most other institutions aren't structured very well to be able to adapt quickly, to understand and then interact with and try and shape and manage these kinds of emerging phenomena.
That makes it easier.
This really is, I think, as Gordon Adams said, the core question of what is the focus and why should we care? And it definitely came up in the Marine Corps week that we spent on conflict prevention, with folks in the military asking the question of why conflict prevention, why care about fragile states. If we look at the country of Nigeria, I think it poses an interesting example, because I think some would say the U.S. has interest in a Nigeria that respects human rights, is democratic, robust, and I think most of USAID's work is geared somehow around those themes of human rights and democracy. The U.S. also has a national interest, some would say, in the oil of Nigeria. As was mentioned, Africa is one of the largest sources of oil. So I think that the U.S. government is somewhat conflicted in terms of its purpose in engaging with fragile states. Do we want a government who can do interest-based negotiation with us, and so that the U.S. would have legitimacy in access to oil, because Nigeria has an interest also in selling it, but how is that process done? And so I think we do need a more honest conversation about the interests and compass of the United States in terms of what are our national interests and really how do we talk about them. I think there have been some Republican authors who said we should just ditch the human rights discourse and realize we are just out for economics and geopolitical power. I don't think that's what the majority of Americans want, and it's not what the majority of the military folks that I have worked with would say they're fighting for. So, but I do think the conflict and never being certain about what it is we're talking about as a country, what is our foreign policy about, makes all these conversations confusing.
Okay, we've still got several here. This gentleman, and then back to you, and then you, please.
Yeah, Cha Chen, freelance correspondent. Last session didn't answer my question. And last session indicated the basic problem is not over there, it's here. And basic is a government problem. The current American political structure just cannot deal with the problem over there. And also, I got to point out, Afghanistan is more difficult than Iraq. Size is bigger. And Iraq, you just can go certain urban center. But in Afghanistan, it's spread over. Yeah. So I think that's very difficult. If we don't straight out the governments here, situation going to get worse. Thank you.
It is ironic that, as people say in Washington, often the most powerful government on earth cannot get its act together on this problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what you're saying because I think that this is really a huge part of what it's all about. We're straddling different concepts of democracy. Some people think of democracy as free and fair elections. Some people think of it as human rights. Some people think of it as rule of law, other institutions, all sorts of different things that are involved. Now, everything is what it is and nothing else. And so long as we're in this type of situation where we want to build everything under the sun that is good and great under the rubric of democracy, we open ourselves up to all sorts of charges of hypocrisy, and we're simply not going to be persuasive around the world. Because if we say democracy is good so long as you get the results right, we're just not going to be persuasive. And I think that what we do need is a more honest discussion. And, from my perspective, it seems to me clear that people that are thinking of a democracy as an end in itself are typically building all sorts of other things into it. Let's think about those things. And maybe in some instances, democracy is the way to go to get those things. In other instances, maybe it's not. Maybe not at this moment. Maybe later on. Maybe we have to build traditions within those societies that would be able to foster a good democracy that wouldn't become corrupt, and so on and so forth. But I think that that's just the nail on the head.
Howard?
Yeah, just a very quick reflection reacting to this last comment. In all the work we've done, or I've done, overseas in places like Liberia, Congo, Burundi, I've never used the word democracy in any of our work. I don't find that's helpful, nor do I find that as the issue. The issue is, as I tried to suggest earlier and more comprehensively in our earlier program, that you've got societies in which people don't see each other as connected to one another. And they see politics as zero-sum, winner-take-all, etc. And so the challenge is to help put people into processes where they begin to re-examine their self-interest and begin to see it differently. Now, if that process works and they begin to understand collaboration as a matter of self-interest, they are led to adopt inclusive processes which, in fact, are, quote, democratic. But that, you don't have to use the word. I mean, democracy is a tool. It's a means of creating a sense of ownership and inclusion for everyone in the society. And so if instead of trying to impose our concepts or institutions, and we begin with the realities on the ground, which is the one of trying to build a sense of connection for people, rebuilding trust, rebuilding relationships, the rest takes care of itself, in my view.
All right, why don't we have one more comment? Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Will Amatruda, Catholic University. One hypothetical and, if you will, counterfactual model for post-conflict reconstruction.
Get in a little closer.
In closer?
Oh.
Yeah.
Was the State Department blueprint for reconstruction in Iraq, the plan which the Department of Defense under Rumsfeld rejected. Has anyone looked at that and tried to evaluate how things might have turned out if it had been tried? And I realize that question may not have an answer because A, it's a counterfactual and wasn't tried, and two, maybe it's still classified and nobody who's read it can talk about it.
Anybody have a quick answer to that one? I don't know. There've been a pile of books this high about the debacle in Iraq. It must be in there somewhere. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's Victor Walker, retired Foreign Service officer. I actually served both in Afghanistan also and did work on a PRT. So I just wanted to react to something here, which is that the SERP funds were seen mostly as a fund for immediate stabilization of, for the soldiers to deal with villages and so forth. And they told me that that concept came out of Vietnam. I don't know if that is true or not. The PRT concept also came out of Vietnam. So what we have is that really a lot of all of this is the security context that we are functioning out. It was not the civilian thing. Now, I was in charge of actually coordinating the work of the civilians in the PRTs, which I won't go into that, but anyhow, that was not an easy job, but it was much easier, I think, in Afghanistan than it would have been in Iraq, because at least in Afghanistan, the PRTs, the soldiers were civilians who are now in, in uniforms, and they had a lot of skills, and so it was very helpful that we could work together. But that was a byproduct of what they were. To the discussion today really intrigued me at the end because I would have thought that the president's, let's talk about Afghanistan again, the president's speech and announcement of the policy, I think it was like in March, wasn't it, or April, would have already, would be the ones and that would have set all of these issues that now seem not to have been resolved for setting it up to be resolved. And so I was quite surprised to hear some of these problems that we are facing here today. It's true that when it comes to state DOD and USAID, is that DOD has the funding because of the security angle of the issue of failed states. And frankly, for me, it was much easier in the end, even though I was a political officer, to talk with our law enforcement officers as well as with our military rather than with my State Department colleagues, because the language changed. And that's one of the problems that we face in State Department. That's it. Thank you.
Well, I think probably this is a good time just to close. There's no more comments. I think Woodrow Wilson, going back to the beginning of the day, is shining down on us, looking down on us, quite pleased. I think we've done more than enough work for a day in terms of tying ideas to policy, and perhaps we made a little progress in actually making some sense out of that nexus. Thanks very much for your participation, and I have yet one more thing to do, and that is to thank the people who made all of this possible. If you could stand up, Sarah Cusin, please. Cussin, sorry. and Gregor Young. And Shah Su, over here. And Mamhadi Diouf, I think, helped as well. I don't think she's here, but, huh? Okay, she's downstairs, so thank you, Mom. So, enjoy the weekend. Let's hope the weather is a little nicer than it was today.